Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Alyssa Lenkel, and I serve as an EV Infrastructure Associate at the Electrification Coalition. This webinar, a part of the EC's Charging Infrastructure series, will be focusing on workplace development as it relates to EVs and the EV charging space. As we progress towards a robust national EV charging network, it's critical that we have the workforce to build and maintain EVs and EV infrastructure. Reflective in its prioritization in recent federal funding announcements, providing workforce training for a variety of jobs is pivotal in making and sustaining this transition. With this in mind, we have brought in 3 panelists that can help you understand what workforce development looks like, what key players must be involved, and how to emphasize workforce development throughout your projects and applications. Each panelist plays a different role, but a vital role in preparing the workforce. To set the stage on workforce development, we have Colleen McLaughlin, a state policy organizer working on clean transportation at Blue Green Alliance. Her role is to engage labor groups as states create plans for meeting their zero-emission vehicle targets, to ensure that transportation electrification creates high-road jobs and protects workers. Before joining BGA, Colleen worked on presidential and congressional campaigns and was a regional director with Environment America, a nonprofit aiming to pass statewide legislation to protect open spaces, clean air, and clean water. In her free time, Colleen enjoys taking trips in her camper van, hiking, climbing, swimming, paddleboarding, reading, writing, and taking walks with her cat. Colleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thanks to the Electrification Coalition for putting on this event. I'm really excited to be here with my fellow speakers to discuss how we ensure this transition to clean transportation is one that provides high road jobs and protects workers across all sectors. So what I'm going to talk about today is first and foremost, what is workforce development? And then I'll dive into specific policies and programs states or other entities can put in place to make sure workforce development is baked into our transition to zero emissions vehicles. So first, what is workforce development? First and foremost, it means preparing the workforce needed to complete a goal or objective, including education, training, financial support, technical assistance, usually through a combination of policies and programs. It also means addressing systemic opportunity and skills gaps for populations who have been disproportionately impacted. So when we're talking about transportation, that typically means folks who have been living in areas with the worst air quality due to the transportation sector. And workforce development also means simply creating new jobs with fair pay, adequate benefits, safe working conditions, the right to organize, and so on. So I'll start off by just giving a little bit of background as we look at this and how it plays out federally. In 2021, the federal government passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which include a lot of funding to transition our infrastructure system and transportation, among many other things. The U.S. Department of Labor and Commerce created the Good Jobs Principles, which are supposed to be applied to all projects receiving federal funding through the BIL and IRA. So I'm going to go through these one by one, highlighting the most common policies and programs in each category. Starting with recruitment and hiring. When projects are funded in whole or in part with federal or state dollars, there should be certain requirements around making sure the community is actually benefiting from that project. And a lot of that is determined in the initial phase where the government entity is choosing a contractor to fulfill the bid. So chosen contractors must include things like local hire, which is exactly what it sounds like, hiring from within the local community, targeted hire provisions, which means employing workers from specific communities, whether that be women, people of color, indigenous peoples, veterans, etc. And any projects that involve construction should have a project labor agreement or community workforce agreement, which establishes terms like wages, hours, and working conditions and dispute resolution methods. When we're talking about transportation electrification, this would apply to the construction of really large EV charging infrastructure depots and also the construction of any EV manufacturing or battery recycling plants. And lastly, community benefits agreements are legally binding agreements to ensure large development or construction projects benefit the community on the whole. Number 2 is benefits. This is pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure you're all familiar. Typical benefits we want to see for workers are health insurance, retirement plans, workman's comp, paid family leave, paid time off, etc. Number 3, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This means that all projects must adhere to Title VI which prevents discrimination based on race or country of origin. But also applicants must have a DEIA plan that shows a concerted effort to support people from underrepresented groups. This could look like partnering with tribes in their area or with businesses owned by people of color, women, or veterans. It must also include a project assessment to make sure it's actually benefiting the community. Number 4, empowerment and representation. This means that the workers have the right to form and join unions without fear of retaliation, and they have a right to collective bargaining and ultimately achieving a collective bargaining agreement, which is a written legal contract between an employer and a union representing the employees. 5, job security and working conditions. This involves adequate hours, predictable schedules, getting paid for overtime. It also includes having a safe and healthy workplace, which means the workplace is adhering to all OSHA regulations, and it actively identifies and addresses workplace hazards as they come up. This also includes proper classification of employees. I'm going to dive into this one a little bit deeper than the others because it is particularly relevant to transportation electrification. Employers sometimes label employees as independent contractors to avoid having to provide benefits or offer other typical worker protections. This is really common in the trucking industry and in rideshare companies. Drivers are classified as independent contractors and are therefore responsible for the cost of their vehicle, cost of all maintenance to the vehicle, insurance, and more. An electric truck can go for upwards of $500,000, and we do not believe that cost should fall on an everyday driver. And if an app-based company like Uber or Lyft that have millions of dollars wants a certain percentage of its fleet to be zero-emission vehicles by a certain year, they should pay for it, not the drivers. Moving on to number 6, organizational culture. This is embedded in most of the other principles, so I won't spend too much time, but again, it includes things like the workplace being free from harassment, discrimination, or retaliation. It involves having healthy working conditions, etc. For pay, we expect a stable and predictable living wage before any overtime, tips, or commission. And this also means that wages should increase with skills and experience. And lastly, skills and career advancement. Mainly, this means registered apprenticeships, which are training programs that combine on-site training and classroom education, either sponsored by employers, industry groups, or labor management training committees. These are common in a couple of the trades involved in building out EV charging infrastructure, like laborers and electricians. So I'm sure you'll hear a lot more on this from Erin shortly. Other industries like manufacturing provide union-affiliated training programs, so they're not called registered apprenticeships, but they similarly provide a combination of classroom and on-the-job skills training. And pre-apprenticeships provide basic training to get people ready to enter apprenticeship programs, where they can learn things like working with the proper tools, getting to know what a work site looks like. Pre-apprenticeships are targeted toward individuals who may face barriers to entry directly into those apprenticeship programs, like workers of color, women, and other disadvantaged communities. Another way to ease barriers to entry are to provide wraparound services like childcare and transportation to folks in apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships. That's something we always advocate for. So now moving on to how this all relates specifically to transportation electrification. The first category I want to focus on is workforce safety. Let's see if I can get back there. Thank you. Transitioning to zero-emission vehicles presents certain challenges for the workers driving and maintaining these vehicles. There is currently no standardized training required for mechanics to work on electric vehicles, even though it entails working with high voltage and can be extremely hazardous. Many mechanics are currently working on electric vehicles without the proper equipment, and drivers are experiencing fewer and shorter breaks and are typically not trained in changes to accident protocols, which poses a safety risk to both the drivers and passengers alike. So we advocate that any entity electrifying a medium or heavy duty fleet should be required to provide these 4 things. First is training for mechanics and annual retrainings as new technologies come up. This includes how to work with high voltage, de-energizing the system, and more. They should also provide personal protection equipment for mechanics, including high voltage gloves, insulating tools, clothing to protect from arc flash, etc. Infrastructure upgrades to mechanic shops. This is a big one. Electric vehicles, especially in the medium and heavy duty space, are much, much heavier than internal combustion engines, vehicles, because of the batteries in them. So mechanic shops, a lot of them need to be retrofitted with new and heavier hydraulic lifts, and also scaffolding. The batteries on buses are on the top of the bus, and without scaffolding, currently what many mechanics are doing is climbing through the vehicle, up through the emergency hatch of the bus, and then kneeling on the roof of the vehicle itself while they work on the battery, which is extremely unsafe. And then lastly, annual safety training for drivers and first responders focused on the dangers of electric vehicles and what to do in case of emergencies and accidents. And then at the bottom here, we point to a couple specific recommendations to protect drivers specifically at transit agencies. First is to adjust accident protocols. Right now, the typical protocol for transit buses, if they get into an accident, is to keep passengers on board. But with an electric bus, you are looking at the potential for that vehicle to catch fire. And even if it doesn't do that, it could likely leak toxic chemicals into the vehicle. So that's an example of a case that we would actually want to change that accident protocol and get passengers off the bus. We also want to consider reconstructing routes and schedules. Transit drivers I've spoken with in Washington who are driving electric buses say there's a lot of time added to every single stop that they make because of the way the braking system is. So it leads to drastically shorter breaks between trips to use the bathroom, eat something, and generally decompress. And all of this poses a great risk, not only to the drivers, but to the passengers and pedestrians on the road as well. So we recommend here this kind of option on the right-hand side is what we've recommended in Washington state, is to require that states only give funding in the form of grants, loans, tax incentives to fleet managers who have already provided all of these things or who have incorporated the cost of training, equipment, and infrastructure upgrades into their funding proposal. All right, on to the next slide. I'll be real quick with the labor standards since we've already covered all this when we were talking about the 8 good jobs principles. Registered apprenticeship programs and pre-apprenticeship programs, as we mentioned. What we can do here is have states or counties provide more funding for these programs so that they could train more people to meet the demand as we continue to electrify transportation and other sectors. Require prevailing wage and apprentice utilization requirements for charging infrastructure projects. That essentially means that a certain percentage of workers on the project must be apprentices. Requiring project labor agreements and community workforce agreements for bulk installations of EV charging infrastructure. And as I mentioned earlier, the construction and operations of EV manufacturing or battery recycling plants. For manufacturers, support or fund incumbent workforce training. And lastly, require employees provide adequate compensation to drivers for charging time and pay them overtime if charging puts them overtime. And now on to my last slide. Last thing we want to do obviously is create jobs. Transforming the transportation system provides a unique opportunity to create jobs here in the US. And one of the main ways to do that is to invest in domestic manufacturing and battery recycling. This would also significantly reduce life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, since currently every single critical mineral mined for EV batteries travels approximately 50,000 miles before it reaches its final point of sale. So the more minerals and battery components we can get here, and the more domestic manufacturing and assembly is done here, the fewer miles those cars will have to travel and the more US jobs will create. So under expanding domestic manufacturing and battery recycling, states can fund or support site development. As I'm sure many of you know, siting and permitting can take years, so starting this early is really critical. And then leverage the federal funds that are available, like the Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit and Domestic Manufacturing Conversion Grants Program. And lastly, procurement requirements. Procuring materials needed as locally as possible is best for the environment, as I mentioned, but also best for ensuring a smooth transition that's not stunted by supply chain constraints or long wait times for equipment. We believe that there should be critical mineral, battery component, and domestic assembly requirements attached to any vehicles purchased in whole or in part with government funds. All EVSC, which stands for Electric Vehicle Service Equipment, and it's basically the charging infrastructure equipment, we believe should come from manufacturers who are Buy America compliant. Some of these companies include FreeWire Technologies, Blink Charging, Tritium, and Juice Bar. And as stated before, there should be priority given to companies who have local hire provisions and labor peace agreements. And also, as I'm sure maybe one of my fellow speakers will mention, when we're talking about EV infrastructure, it's not just the charger itself. There's a lot of site prep work that needs to be done There's concrete, rebar, things like that that need to be obtained in order to put in EV chargers. So all of those materials we would like to see domestically manufactured as well. So that concludes my long list of recommendations for how to transition to zero emissions vehicles with a strong focus on workforce development, safety, and job creation. If we could just go to that last slide, I just want folks to have our website and my email. There we go. Feel free to check out BJ's website or email me directly with any questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Colleen. And a reminder to just put any questions that you have in the Q&A portion, and we'll get to that at the end. But yeah, thank you so much, Colleen. That was a great resource, and especially information about workplace safety and independent contractor considerations. That's super helpful, not just for organizations, but also for the individuals to advocate for themselves as workers. That's huge. So thank you so much. Up next, to demonstrate training and opportunities for electricians, we have Aaron Brown. Aaron serves as the Green Energy Representative for the 4th District of IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. At his district, they train and support electricians through an apprentice program, utilizing the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program, EVITP, in their curriculum alongside hands-on experience. Aaron was formerly the business manager of IBEW's local union 540 in Canton, Ohio, and has been a member of IBEW for 25 years and finished his apprenticeship in 2003. Aaron, take it away.
All right, thanks, Alyssa, for the kind introduction. Let's go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to cover the EVITP training that we put on with our local JATCs. So I am Aaron Brown with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And we have a 5-year apprenticeship program in some of our locals. We also have a 4-year program. History of the program and the goals of the program and the program structure is what we're going to cover today. Okay, 2.1, charging equipment, introduction and overview. This introduces the various types of equipment that can be used to charge or supply power to electric vehicles. Charging equipment can supply alternating current to a vehicle, which is converted to direct current, DC, to charge the battery, or supply DC directly to a vehicle's battery. Charging equipment can transfer power either via direct coupling, cord, and plug, or wirelessly. Upon completion of this section, students should be able to demonstrate awareness of the various terminologies used throughout the EV industry to describe equipment used to supply energy to EV batteries, understand the development of early EV charging equipment, and describe the difference between AC electric vehicle supply equipment and DC electric vehicle charging equipment. Okay, section 2.2 reviews electric vehicle supply equipment that supplies alternating current to electric vehicles. In the US, EVSE has been standardized by the Society of Automotive Engineers standard. The SAE standard specifies the plug configuration, safety figures, and maximum AC voltage and current for EVSE. Charge times for EVs vary greatly based on the capacity of equipment, both internal and external to the vehicles. This section will introduce these variables, allowing proper sizing for the end user. Upon completion of this section, students should be able to explain the importance of the EVSE safety features required by the SAE standards and how they function. Classify the levels of EVSE specified by AC voltage and current levels. Diagram the pin configuration of J1772 standard and explain the purpose of the pins in the charging of an EV. Define the variables that determine the required charge time for an EV. Okay, section 2.3, DC charging overview. DC charging reviews the advantages of DC QC versus supplying EVs with alternating current, AC, and direct current DC fast chargers, also known as DC quick chargers, are capable of charging electric vehicles quickly with an output range between 50 and 400 kW. Upon completion of this section, the students should be able to describe the various types and sizes of DC charging equipment available in the marketplace, define the safety feature of DC charging equipment, identify the difference between the various DC charging equipment connector configurations, understand the AC voltage and current requirements of DC charging equipment for proper service load calculations. Also be aware of the load created by electrical vehicle charging equipment on building service and serving utilities. Wireless charging overview. So this is an overview of the wireless charging, introduces the concept of wireless charging of electric vehicles, utilizing the principle of induction. The wireless charging of an EV, energy is transferred between coils often mounted beneath the EV and another set mounted near the bottom of the vehicle, as you can see described in that picture. Upon completion of this section, students should be able to understand the difference between wireless EV charging and traditional coupled conductive charging, define the key components of wireless EV charging equipment and purpose, explain the benefits and drawbacks of wireless charging, and recognize wireless charging as an up and coming technology still in development. Network and EVSE communications learning objectives. So upon completion of this section, students should be able to explain what an EV network does for consumers and entities supporting public EV charging equipment. Understand the various methods by which charging networks generate revenue. CC credit card processing, network cards, keypad, and pay by phone. Identify the charging networks commonly available around the US and Canada. Explain the methods utilized by networked EV charging equipment for communication. Okay, this completes my slideshow. So this is just a snapshot of what we present in our 5th year or our 4th year class for our apprentices, but we also allow our inside wiremen to attend these classes and get that certification as well. Thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron. IBEW is a great example of an organization that fosters that collaboration and continued professional development. So we really appreciate a peek into what all goes on in the apprenticeship. So thank you. Up next, we have Jeff Brock, CEO and co-founder of Heartland Charging Services. Jeff works with clients across the Midwest to support their business objectives through their investments in EV infrastructure and real estate. Prior to stepping into the entrepreneur world, Jeff was the president at Loth AFT for over 10 years. Additionally, Jeff is a former principal member of the National Association of Industrial and Office Properties, NAIOP, and has served on the organization's Public Relations Committee. He is a past executive committee member for the American Heart Association. Jeff also served more than 10 years on the governing board of directors for the Children's Hunger Alliance, where he held the board's executive chair position. In 2000, he served on the alumni advisory board of Ball State University, where he holds a bachelor's in science degree. Jeff has been recognized by Business First as a 40 under 40 business leader, along with a Smart Business Leaders Award. Jeff and his wife, Joelle, have 3 adult children that are active in their communities. Chances are, if they are not spotted on the golf course, they can be seen enjoying their place with friends and family on Buckeye Lake. Both Brocks are highly active in community involvement and with local and global philanthropic initiatives. Jeff will tell us a little bit more about the makeup of the workforce beyond electricians, as well as the current state of the user experience for charging interactions and how training is needed to continue to support equipment reliability. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you folks today, and thought this would be a nice chance to give you an overview of what's kind of happening out there, post installation of electric vehicle charging, and how we might be able to help give you some knowledge on how you can maybe take a look at this journey, not only in your business but in your personal path as well. So if we can pull up the slide deck, I'll move through a couple things here very quickly, and look for any questions as we wrap up. So first thing I thought I'd share with you, the company that I've co-founded and I own, we basically plan, provide, and maintain EV infrastructure. The majority of our focus is on that day 2 back-end EV infrastructure. And I'm going to walk you through why that's so important for reliability and how we can keep this product up and running and keep it alive so that users don't have as many issues as we currently do. A lot of times we help share with folks insights to how fast this adoption is really coming. If you look at the rates of where the adoption is going across the country, it's outpaced all experts' expectations and predictions over the last 24 months and continues to do so. What we also find is that there's about $210 billion of investment that's coming into this space through the years of 2030. Most of that's coming in from the OEMs of the manufacturing of the automobile industry. And a lot of that is coming in now domestically very fast. Ford, GM, Chrysler, Stellantis are really pushing all in. And we like to let folks know, I mean, that train has already kind of left the station. Those manufacturers are switching out their production and are not going to be manufacturing both ICEs and EVs long-term in the future. It just doesn't create a cost scenario that works for them. The big thing that we like to make sure that everybody understands, currently in the domestic United States, there's about 138 EV chargers out in the wild, if you will, from coast to coast. By 2030, it's estimated that domestically we'll need about 13 million to accommodate the growth trajectory that we're working on. Sometimes that number can move a little bit up and down, but regardless of what that number is, we're nowhere close to be able to accommodate the amount of power that's going to be coming in and how we can accommodate it with the right type of equipment. What's really important there, and a lot of times what we try to help our clients with before we really get into the value of the workplace development in terms of keeping this operating equipment up and running for EV charging, is that the trend shows that at some point, as we get through the NEVI plan and the IRA distributing out dollars to put chargers along the corridor, the main flux that's happening across the country is that about 40% of our community are renters. So as they go out and buy an EV vehicle and get a charger that comes with it, they're not necessarily in a situation where they can just get home and charge, because that home might be an apartment or a condo or perhaps a townhome. So we do know that 80% of the charging behavior tends to happen at home or work. So how we address this multifamily situation and how we can also continue to make sure that we're focused on diversity and inclusion and equity, we need to make sure that we have reliable equipment that stays up and running. What we see a great deal about is the majority of the equipment that comes in through the charging industry, through the OEMs, really rely upon remote diagnostics to keep product up and running. And initially, as Aaron also shared, there's a tremendous amount of focus on the day one installation with electrical connection to the equipment. But what we find that's really, really missing and the biggest gap is the day two technical service to keep all this equipment up and running. Because once the connection is made and the power is in the actual unit, it becomes more of a motherboard of technology and computer than it does an actual electrical piece of equipment that needs power. It actually needs to be serviced on a proactive basis. A lot of these physical ailments that you see in this slide here are not necessarily caught through a remote diagnostics pinging from the manufacturer. So just for an example, a cracked screen or a gel screen that's been faded out by weather, those types of issues really put downtime into the ability to use and rely upon that equipment. And what we also know is currently across the domestic United States, about 1 in every 4 charging experience has some kind of issue, meaning you go to actually use the charger and it doesn't work. So being able to have the right type of people in the local and regional community to make sure that you can address that and keep that equipment up and running is equally as important as the locating of the equipment, the utility upgrades, and how do you install it. Some of the things that we put a tremendous amount of focus on is not only the initial engineering and the initial focus around electrical work. Those are very, very important parts of what we do, but also what Colleen had mentioned earlier around the safety associated with this equipment. Having people that are interacting with this equipment, they need to understand not only the aspects of the power that's going into them, but the technology that it's supporting. Oftentimes what we find is if you're not familiar with that technology or do not have a functioning inventory of that manufacturer's equipment, you can't really get that equipment back up and running quickly. So those outages become more and more challenging, and it really prevents a lot of adoption from happening. So we're really focused and dedicated on finding tech service support that can take not only some of the apprentice sites that Aaron had mentioned in some of his conversation around getting people familiar and learning about that definite skill set with electric vehicle installation, but more importantly, how do you continue to maintain it once it's installed and being able to go out to the site and continually to keep it updated. So this is a variety of lists that we have that we share with our folks about what are the skill sets needed and how do you continue to recruit and find people to do those jobs. That's about what I have as it relates to giving an overview of kind of the day two experience around keeping the electric vehicle charging network up. Happy to answer any questions or open it up back to Alyssa, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Jeff. We appreciate the opportunity to have you. That was a really helpful presentation and kind of paints the full picture of all those key players in developing that workforce to support widespread EV charger adoption. With that, I'd like to invite all panelists back on the screen as we move into the audience questions. We've gotten a couple questions in, some of them more specifically towards one or more presenter, but this first one here can be answered by anyone who feels like taking a stab at it. So the first question was, someone wants to start a new career in charger installation, but does not have any experience. What would you recommend as their first step?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and answer that. So the main thing is to look up the IBEW local union with the city that you obviously currently live in or nearby, and have them apply at their joint apprenticeship training center. Or some of the locals have what we call as a construction wireman, construction electrician classification. And that can get their foot in the door to working out on these job sites and working with our journeyman and apprentice electricians.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. Kind of going off of that, we also got a question from the audience about what might you recommend for how to begin working with the local IBEW to get more workers certified in EVITP? So maybe not just people who want to be electricians, but how can the community kind of advocate that resource and spread that information for those that do?
Yeah. So currently right now, the EVIT, I believe it's 8,000 hours. So once you have the 8,000 hours of on-the-job training, you obviously can qualify to get this training. So you need to be in one of the programs or become part of the IBEW at some point and meet that requirement, and then we'll give you that training. I believe most of our JATCs, our Joint Apprenticeship Training Centers, do have that training in their facility.
Great. Thanks so much. This next question should probably hit for a couple of you. So we have, can you talk a little bit more about how you plan to update your training programs to adapt to market trends, technological advancements, and just changes in the EV space generally?
Yeah, I'm happy to mention what we do. We do a continuous rotation training that starts and begins with safety, most importantly. But as you may know, each one of these manufacturers that put out this equipment all have their own network, and they all are trying to differentiate themselves inside of that network and the systems behind that. So we have continuing education training that's mandatory for our folks every 6 months. That keeps everybody up on what's happening, not only with the equipment that we support, but what else is actually out there. And then lastly, we do a lot of field on-the-job training where we're out in multiple different weather conditions, multiple different geographies in the country, to make sure we understand what's happening in those markets with adoption and how EVs being applied in those communities.
Great, thank you so much. Aaron, I was wondering if you kind of could weigh in on your training programs, if they adapt at all, or if they're pretty set in stone with the EVITP curriculum.
Yeah, so we're set in stone with obviously the curriculum that they present to us. But one of the questions I do see is, it says, how are local community members being recruited to be involved in this new workforce? So just so you guys understand, the IBEW have a couple of affinity groups. With our Renew groups, we have our Women's Committee, we have our Veterans Committee, and we also have our Minority Committee. So we're out there, we're recruiting, and obviously all three of those affinity groups. And we got our small works program, and then obviously our apprenticeship and our journeyman level. So we're doing everything that we can to obviously meet the demands of this work coming our way.
That's a great question. This next one is specifically for Colleen. They asked, is BGA working with California EV incentive administering agencies to implement the recommended workforce and related standards, examples CARB, CEC, etc.?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I do have quite a few colleagues in California. So short answer is yes. I know there's many coalitions that deal with all these different siloed programs and policies, but yeah, CARB, CEC, we've been working on clean cars, advanced clean trucks, and in many different states that we're involved in.
Great, awesome. And then we have a federal funding focus question, which I think everybody can kind of chime in as applicable, but have any of you worked with applicants for federal funding? And if you have, what recommendations did you give to ensure their application met or exceeded the requirements of workforce development?
So we have worked with some federal funding grant applications, more in the Midwest than we have on the coast. What I would offer or share it is completely different from one geography to the next in terms of rollout. And for an example, we're working closely with several operators that are raising their hand for NEVI dollars associated with a highway corridor planning. And for the most part, there's standards within ODOT that provide these solutions out from the Department of Transportation. But the best thing to do is probably connect with a local municipal or city and how they're addressing some of these grant dollars, and then find your way from there.
Great, makes sense. Just wanted to give space to any of the other speakers if you have experience with federal funding. We have a few more questions coming in, but wanted to make sure that was open to you guys as well.
I personally have not in my role at BGA, but BGA does get involved in it in several states that we operate in, largely to attach either procurement requirements or apprentice utilization requirements, PLAs, things like that to any projects that they're requiring funding for.
Gotcha. This next question comes for all presenters. What are existing programs that local governments can invest in to strengthen the EVSE workforce?
So that's a really good question. So just so you guys understand, with the IBEW, we're all self-funded. So all of our apprenticeship centers and training is supported by the NECA and the IBEW through an LMCC, and obviously that's paid into per the collective bargaining agreement. So we're all self-funded. There's no taxpayer money that goes to our JATCs or any of that. Now, there might be some funding out there that I'm not aware of at this time, but right now we self-fund everything that we do.
Yeah, I would just add on to that, when the legislative session comes around again, definitely getting more funding in the state budget for apprenticeship programs can be helpful. I know IVW is self-funded, but there are ways to get funding directly towards these EVIT programs or joint apprentice training centers. So the more funding that they have, the more people they can accept. I know several places here in Washington, they're only able to accept about 25% of the applicants they get for their apprenticeship program because they simply don't have enough trainers, space, or in some cases, like the jobs to actually put the apprentices in. So I think one thing to just draw a finer line to everything that we've been talking about so far, specifically for electricians, the way the apprenticeship works is, apprentices are going to on-site jobs throughout their entire 4-year-long apprenticeship. So there need to be the jobs in place in order to bring on more apprentices, since it's not just entirely classroom training. So at least in my experience in Washington and Colorado, there does need to be better communication between the contractors and the electricians fulfilling those contracts, and who's putting those up for bid, and just a little bit of a more streamlining of how these contracts are going to market and who's bidding on them and what workforce development requirements they have in their proposals.
Well said, Colleen.
Yeah, really well said. We have a couple more questions coming in. So I think we have about 2 more. So if you have been holding out on putting in your question, make sure to do it now because we're about to wrap up here. But this question says, can each of you speak to your experience engaging with utility companies and what you see as their role in workforce development?
I can offer, where we're domiciled, we're in a deregulated state. There's about 12 different utility providers that we interact with on a consistent basis. Some of them are very in touch with how updated service is being proactively planned for and pushed out. Some of them are very reactive and still trying to figure out what's the right path to do so. There's not a one size fits all. What we find oftentimes that are some challenges. Typically, we're working with developers or clients that are upgrading their surface lot experience. It's not a true new build construction application, so they don't know exactly where to put you in terms of permitting and getting the right types of approvals in a very timely manner. So trying to have some advocacy with those utility companies to figure out how they can be more efficient and effective with timely executing on these types of projects. The other is, clearly there is going to be a continued need for upgrading utility and service, and being able to have some proactive discussions around that become really critical versus just waiting until somebody looks to develop it or put it in.
For sure. That's a great point. We see that with most conversations around working with utilities is to have those conversations early. So that's a great piece of advice. Anybody else wanted to jump in?
I'll just chime in. I know a lot of utilities are starting to give basically rebates to folks for installing their EV chargers. So either paying for the whole cost of it if folks are coming from an economically disadvantaged community, or part of it if they're not, or just a bunch of incentive programs. And usually the utilities have that on their website. So I just encourage you to go to your specific utilities website and see if they have any of those.
Great. Well, this looks like it's going to be the last question coming in, but it's a good one. I think that we can all kind of end on, and everyone can kind of give their 2 cents to it. What do you think are some gaps that need to be filled when it comes to training and certification in this industry?
I can start just by re-emphasizing, to me, one of the biggest gaps is definitely the lack of training for EV mechanics. This is, as Aaron mentioned, there's EVITP certification for electricians installing the charging infrastructure, but working on the actual vehicles themselves, especially when it's medium or heavy duty vehicles with really large and high voltage batteries, can be extremely hazardous if people don't have the proper training And then I would loop into that also the equipment and the infrastructure at the actual mechanic shops. I'll pause there and let others chime in.
Yeah, I would say, aligned, partner and distribution with OEM manufacturers that provide local real-time support that keeps infrastructure up and running is really, really critical. I think most of what you'll find is that there's several outages that happen, and those products become kind of lying there dormant until somebody actually gets there to fix it, and that can be a really long time. So having some consistent metrics to how that works and really being less nationally focused but more local, regionally focused with that service, I think becomes really important.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of base it off what Colleen said. For us, obviously we show up on a job site, we install conduit, pull wires, and obviously make some terminations. So where the training that we see, is going to be on the actual units, kind of like what Jeff had mentioned there. So, for us, it's pretty, black and white with the EVITP training.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Just to clarify for the attendees, we've been told that there's been a lot of specific questions kind of about your organizations wanting to speak further with the speakers. So at their level of comfort, we will be sharing their emails and ways to get in contact with them in the wrap-up email. So hold on to those good specific questions. But with that, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our speakers for sharing their wisdom and expertise today and helping us to paint a clear picture of what workforce development looks like. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending and encourage you to stick around for the following slides so you can get involved with the EC's upcoming events. We have Charging Infrastructure Week coming up in October, which is an action-packed week centered around accelerating and supplementing our national charging network, as well as another installment of this webinar series in December focused on charging in multi-unit dwellings. So we look forward to seeing you guys then, and thank you so much for attending. Bye, everybody.